This is the Black Wall Street Chronicles. How you guys doing tonight? Yeah, tonight we're going to be talking about PSTD, post-traumatic stress syndrome. And the reason why we're talking about that because it seems to be prominent in our community. They're saying that we are more likely to struggle with PTSD more than white Americans because what has happened to us within this country. So we're going to be talking about that. Before we get started, I want to talk about the trial that's going on with the young black man who's been convicted for killing that white girl. Apparently, let's get that information on that case. Give me a moment. Yeah, just so you know, I got that new Mortal Kombat 11, y'all. I'm excited about that. That's going to be amazing. So... when I come back, I'll give you that information. But let's get right into the post-traumatic stress syndrome going on in the community. So, this is from an article for Psychiatry Research. It's called Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder in African Americans, a 2-year follow-up study. Few studies have examined the relationship between post-traumatic stress disorder and racial group states, and the limited research that has been conducted has produced mixed findings. There is some evidence to suggest that African Americans may experience higher rates of PTSD than individuals from racial ethnic groups. For example, a study using data from the National Epidemiologic Survey on Alcohol and Related Conditions found that African Americans had significantly higher lifetime prevalent rates of PTSD than whites, and that the risk for developing PTSD was 1.2 times higher amongst African Americans compared to whites after adjusting for characteristics of trauma. While comparative studies can provide group estimates of risk, within group studies can provide important information with regard to factors related to illness among members of a specific demographic. Several studies have examined the factors associated with racial differences for PTSD, combining two epidemiologic surgeries. The National Survey of American Life reported that the increased risk for African Americans developing PTSD in comparison to whites was attributable, at least in part, to increased exposure to major trauma such as crime. Similarly, a study of pregnant women found that higher rates of both lifetime and current PTSD among African Americans in comparison to whites were explained by greater trauma exposure. Recent results from the Detroit neighborhood study showed that 87.2% of predominantly African American sample reported at least one diagnostic and statistical manual of mental disorders criteria, a type of lifetime traumatic event, and that 17% of those who experienced a trauma met criteria for probable lifetime PTSD. Other studies of PTSD that have included comparisons between African Americans and whites have also found that African Americans were more exposed to serious traumatic events and had fewer economic resources than whites to cope with these events. The NESARC study showed that African Americans had significantly higher exposure to child maltreatment, due to primarily to higher rates of witnessing domestic violence and to assaultive violence, unwanted sex, physical attacks, and beatings and kidnappings. 14% and 29.3% respectively compared to whites. Therefore, greater prevalence of severe traumatic events among African American individuals may be one factor that accounts for higher rates of PTSD within the population. Overall, little is known about within group clinical characteristics of PTSD in African Americans. For example, in the general population, PTSD is associated with higher rates of comorbid major depression and other anxiety disorders such as generalized anxiety disorders, panic disorders, social anxiety, and agoraphobia. But there is scarce evidence about PTSD comorbidity in the African American population, especially with major depressive disorder. The NSAL study showed that the lifetime prevalence estimate of MDD in African Americans is 10.4%, and that it is a chronic and debilitating disorder for this population. In an earlier epidemiological study, African Americans were found to be significantly less likely to have a mood disorder than white Americans, but had higher odds of persistence of the disorder than their counterparts. Exploration of within group differences regarding an African American individuals is also needed. A comprehensive framework of multi-level factors, social economic status, stressors, kinship and social support, quality healthcare, influencing depression in African Americans, especially men, have been recently proposed. Most of the studies examine comorbid PTSD and depression among African Americans, combine this group with other minority groups, generally because African American samples are usually small, to allow meaningful analysis. An exception to this is a study conducted with Vietnam War veterans showing that although rates with PTSD were similar for white and African Americans, white veterans were significantly more likely to receive a diagnosis of depressive disorder than African Americans. To our knowledge, there is no extant study that prospectively evaluates the course of PTSD in African American sample with a longitudinal study designed within the exception of a study of post-traumatic stress syndromes. After Hurricane Katrina in a predominantly African American sample, the study revealed that 45.4% of low-income mothers reported severe PTSS in the first survey, between 7 and 9 months after the hurricane, compared to 32.7% in the second survey, between 43 and 54 months after the hurricane, and the sample was scored suggesting that probably PTSD was 33%. Examining the course of disorder using a longitudinal design is better to understand the natural course of the disorder and the clinical predictors of rates of recovery and recurrence. Most longitudinal studies with mostly white participants have used self-reported scales to assess the severity and persistence of PTSD symptoms. A more accurate assessment of the course of a mental disorder requires rigorous, structured clinical interviews. A within-group longitudinal study of PTSD among African Americans that utilize clinical interview data with multiple time points and short intervals will provide specific evidence and necessary to understand how the illness unfolds in this population. This type of study also may help unpack some of the questions raised by comparative correlation data or race differences. Although there is little evidence about the course of PTSD in African Americans, it is reasonable to expect a low recovery rate from PTSD and comorbid conditions for this population, given some evidence that African Americans have decreased resources for mental health treatments. Ineffective coping strategies to handle traumatic experience, like likelihood of exposure to severe traumas, especially child abuse, high levels of stress in traumatized individuals, and overrepresentation in lower socioeconomic disadvantaged communities. Traumas are more likely to occur in urban areas where minority populations are overrepresented. Furthermore, experience of negative life events in neighborhoods and high in social disorder and economic disadvantages have a higher impact in individuals' mental health. In the current study, we provide the first perspective report of the course of PTSD in African Americans. The study objectifies where to examine the 2-year course of PTSD and to evaluate differences between African Americans with PTSD and anxiety disorders and African Americans with anxiety disorders but no PTSD. In this comparison, including comorbidity, psychosocial impairment, physical and emotional functioning, and treatment participation. This comparison is important because it may help guide treatment planning for anxiety disorders in this population by advancing the understanding of their complexities and thereby strategizing integrative treatments for individuals experience more than one anxiety disorder. The study examines the course of PTSD in comparison with the course of MDD. These comparisons will allow contrasting clinical characteristics and course of PTSD with other disorders in this population. Because this was an exploratory study and the literature did not support a strong directional statement about the course of PTSD in African Americans, we thought that we did not have enough of a foundation to formulate a hypothesis. Together, these analyses provide a more complete clinical picture of PTSD among African Americans that has been available in literature to date and offer guidance to the diagnosis and treatment of PTSD for this population. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about part 2 of this article. Thank you. Yeah, welcome back to Black Wall Street Chronicles. This is part 2 of the article I was reading earlier called Psychiatry Research, Offer Manuscript. Okay. Here's part 2. This part 2 of this article is going to show the method on how they're examining PTSD in the African American community. The current sample included 165 African American diagnosed with an anxiety disorder at baseline and participation in HARP-2, which is a prospective, naturalistic, and longitudinal study of 439 adults with a current or past history of anxiety disorders. Inclusion criteria included at least 18 years of age at intake or a past or current diagnosis of at least one of following index disorders: PTSD, panic disorder with agoraphobia without history of panic disorder, generalized anxiety disorder or social anxiety disorder. Inclusion criteria included the presence of an organ-brain syndrome, a history of schizophrenia, or current psychosis and intake. Participants were recruited via referral by local mental providers. Advertisement in newspapers, internet postings, and on mass transportation. Potential participants were first briefly screened over the telephone. Those with endorsing anxiety symptoms were invited for an intake interview and paid $60 following the interview as compensation for their participation. Each participant who complete a follow-up interview was similarly compensated. All of the participants provided informed consent before the intake interview. The study was fully approved by the Institutional Review Board of Brown University. The methods are described in detail elsewhere. The procedure. All intake assessments were conducted in person after participants were briefly screened over the telephone. Data collected via structured diagnostic interviews administered at intake that included assessment of current and lifetime history of relevant psychiatric conditions, including the structured clinical interview of DSM IV Axis 1 disorders non-patient version. Traumatic events at baseline were assessed using a revised version of the trauma assessment for adults. Participants were asked about the lifetime traumatic events to identify their most stressful trauma. PTSD symptoms were assessed in response to that event with the SCID-NP. Interviews were conducted by clinical interviews with a bachelor's or master's degree in psychiatry or a related field. Interviewers completed a rigorous training program before being certified to conduct intake and follow-up interviews after certification. All clinical interviews remain closely supervised. HARP-2 clinical staff reviewed each diagnosis for each case rolled in a study of weekly team meeting. Further, all interviews underwent a rigorous clinical editing process to ensure accuracies of diagnostics. Measures. Follow-up interviews were conducted at 6 months intervals for the first 2 years using the longitude interview follow-up evaluation upjohn, which is a structured interview that uses a charge point method with a 6-point psychiatric status rating scale that is scored for each week of the follow-up interview. A PSR of 5 or 6 indicates that the participants meets full DSM-V diagnostic criteria for a disorder with moderate or severe functional impairment, respectively. A PSR of 3 or 4 indicates that participants does not meet full DSM-4 diagnostic criteria for the disorder but still exhibits notable residual symptoms and impairment to a mild or moderate degree, respectively. A PSR of 1 or 2 indicates that the participant is either completely without symptoms of the disorder or experience a negligible number of symptoms on the occasional and transition basis, i.e. full recovery. The Life Up employs a change point method to anchor participants' reports of symptom levels to relevant life events such as birthdays, holidays, etc., resulting in weekly ratings of psychiatric symptom severity, interrater ratability, and long-term test relatability for the Life Up PSR rating has been found to be a good to excellent for all anxiety disorders. A major depressive disorder is also used to collectively monthly information on functioning in a variety of areas including family, relationships, role functioning, life satisfaction, global social adjustment, and global assessment of functioning. With good inter-rater relatability for those items with intra-class correlation coefficients ranging from 0.59 to 0.91. In a paper exploring the long-term interracial relatability of the Life Up and HARP 1 study, which employed the same rater training and fidelity monitoring procedures as the current study. The intra-class correlation coefficients was good to excellent across disorders as well as across different raters over time. The present study recovery was defined as a period of 8 consecutive weeks at a PSR of 1 or 2, being virtually asymptomatic for 2 months. This definition of recovery has been widely used in longitudinal studies examining the course of PTSD, other anxiety and mood disorders, and personality disorders. Life Up psychological functioning was used to collect monthly information on functioning in a variety of areas. Participants were asked about overall degree of satisfaction in areas such as employment, schoolwork, household activities, relationships with friends and families, and recreation. Global social adjustment was the examiner's ratings of participants functioning in these areas. Both ratings refer to the month prior to intake assessment. This measure has good inter-rater relatability for terms with intra-class correlation coefficients ranging from 0.59 to 0.91. Intra-class correlation coefficients were found to be good to excellent across disorders, as well as across different raters over time in a study HARP 1 cohort, which employed the same rater training and fidelity monitoring procedures as the current study. The RAND 36 Item Health Survey. The RAND 36 Item Health Survey was used to assess functional status. This is a self-report measure that assesses physical functioning, bodily pain, role limitation due to physical and mental health concerns, general mental health, social functioning, energy, fatigue, and general health perceptions. All items were scored so that the lowest and highest possible scores are set at 0 and 100 respectively. Items in the same domain are averaged together to create the 8 scale scores. These domains were combined into 2 component scales, the mental component summary and the physical component summary, reported in C scores to facilitate comparison with national norms. Relatability and validity of the instrument is well established. Cronbach's alpha for the different domains is ranging from 0.78 to 0.90. For the current sane, Cronbach alpha for the domains range from 0.63 to 0.93. The 0.63 represents social functioning and the 0.93 represents physical functioning, with a mean alpha of 0.83 across all domains, indicating good relatability for this measure in the African American sample. Psychiatric and physical disability status along with sources of financial report. i.e. disability payments, which assessed with the HARP-2 intake democratic questionnaire created for the HARP project. Psychosocial treatment status, including lifetime history of treatment utilization and psychiatric hospitalizations, was measured on the types of treatment, form, and interview administered from design from the HARP study. Suicide history was assessed using the Life Suicide History Assessment. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, I'm going to give you the statistical analysis and then the results. And after the results, I'm going to tell you what's going to be the agenda for the next show. Welcome back to Black Wall Street Chronicles. It's always a pleasure for you guys to watch and listen to my podcast. So, before I finish the statistical analysis of this report and the statistical analysis and the results of the report, the reason why I wanted to talk about the PTSD situation in our community, because we have a mental disability issue within our community and we don't talk about it. And the reason why we don't talk about it, because we always want to show strength from, we want to show this system, this unjust system, that we're strong all the time. And because of that, we are not talking about the issues and the mental disabilities that we face, and causes situations where, you have crabs in a barrel within our own community that want to kill each other because of the issues that we have inside that we have to talk about. So, I'm going to finish the statistical analysis, and we're going to talk about the results of this experiment they did with African Americans, that 439 African Americans that have PTSD, and we're gonna end the show. So let's get to it. So here's the statistical analysis. Descriptive statistics were calculated for the participants with and without PTSD. Chi-square analysis for categorical variables and two-tailed independent t-tests for continuous variables were calculated to compare both groups of demographic, clinical, and functioning variables. Effect sizes are reported as Kramer V for chi-square analysis, R for t-test, large for both measures of effect size. All analyses were conducted with SPSS 16.0 longitudinal data was analyzed using standard survival analysis techniques. Captain Mayer life tables were constructed for time to recovery analysis. Data for participants who were lost to follow-up were censored. Results. Okay, here's the results of their experiments. Demographic and clinical characteristics. Of the 165 African Americans in HARP 2, 67 were diagnosed with PTSD, which is 40.6%. At intake, the study sample had a mean age of 41 to 111. 97 was single. 41.54. 101, 67% of the people that was diagnosed with PTSD were female. 97% were single, separated, or divorced. 89% had at least some college education. 53% had at least some college education. And 118 were unemployed, and 108 had an annual income of less than $20,000. This is interesting. So, majority of the people who had PTSD were female. 53% had some college education. 71% were unemployed, and 65% had an annual income of less than $20,000. So the majority of the people out of this study that had PTSD was female, and they was unemployed, and they had an annual income less than $20,000. This is interesting. Table 1 compares demographic characteristics between participants with PTSD and those with anxiety disorders but no PTSD. Demographic differences were found, except that African Americans with PTSD were more likely to have physical and psychiatric disabilities than individuals without PTSD. This is interesting. The average age of PTSD onset was 20 years old. The duration of the PTSD in years had a mean of 23. 63 participants reported that their first PTSD episode, no prior history, remained current. So the average age of PTSD was 20.1 SD range. 94% of the participants reported that their first PTSD episode remained current. Interesting. With regard to current access 1 disorders at intake in the total sample, 94 people, 57% participants had GAD 85. Had 80 GAD, and 51%, which is 85 people, had social anxiety. 77 people, which is 46.6%, had a panic disorder with an agoraphobia. 10% had panic disorder without agoraphobia, and 78% had MDD. Had a substance use. 13 had a substance use disorder, and 3.6% had a mystic disorder. 61 of the total sample were psychosocial treatment at the intake. 46% had a history of suicide attempts, and 36.4% had a history of psychiatric hospitalizations. So let's run this back. 54% had GAD. So you have 57% had social anxiety. 46.6% had panic disorder with agoraphobia. 47% had MDD. 7% had a substance use disorder. 61 people, which is 36%, had the total sample were in psychosocial treatment at the intake. 27% had a history of suicide attempts, and 36% had a history of psychiatric hospitalizations. Wow, this PTSD thing is really a problem within our community. It's interesting. I'm going to talk a little bit more about it next week and in the beginning of the episode, but the main thing we're going to focus next week is on the gender politics issues within our community. But it seems here that the majority of the individuals that struggle with PTSD here says that it's women, but they're not talking about the men. Find it very interesting. Okay, I want everybody to have a blessed night. God bless you. Take care.